Hi, it's James here for Recognition of Prior Learning. Today on this video I'm going to be removing a rear wheel from a motorcycle, and I'm also going to be removing a front wheel on a front wheel drive car. And I'm going to show you a little bit about the processes I go through when I do those things. So let's jump in, let's check the video out.
The first thing I do is loosen the axle nut while the wheel is on the ground. On this bike, it's necessary to remove the chain guard. I then use a jack to jack up the rear wheel about an inch or two and remove the axle nut entirely. Then the washer and right hand tensioner. I then use a rubber mallet to softly tap out the axle. Once it is out, I push the wheel forward to move the drive chain out of the way. I can then slide out the wheel assembly. To put the wheel back in, I put the spacers back into place, as they tend to fall out during this process. Give them a clean if need be. These ones are fine. I then push the brake piston back in using a small pry bar with a rubber tip to avoid damaging the brake pads. I then slide the wheel back into place. Grease up the axle. Insert the axle. Put the right hand tensioner back on, the washer, and then the nut. I then put the chain back on the rear sprocket and chock it with a rag. When I push down on the wheel, this puts pressure forward to make sure that the tensioners are firm up against the swing arm before tightening the nut. Because I've pushed the brake piston back, I now pump the rear brake to make sure that the pads are seated properly. I then lower the jack, look up the torque specs for the rear axle nut, get my torque wrench and do it up to spec. And that's a motorcycle rear wheel removed and put back safely.
So that's a motorcycle, quite a bit different. We'll jump in and we'll check out how we do a car.
First, I chock the rear wheels and apply the handbrake on the car. I then break the tension on the wheel nuts using a breaker bar, loosen them in a star pattern, or in this case a cross pattern. I then jack up the wheel and place a support stand. By hand, I then remove the wheel nuts and finally the wheel assembly. I can then fully inspect the wheel's condition and inspect the valve stem's condition. I inspect the wheel on both sides for any damage. I can also check the thread on the wheel studs and the wheel nuts to make sure they are clean and in good condition. I then put the wheel back on and put the nuts on hand tight. Then I do them up with a tool just so they sit plush so that the wheel is seated correctly on the studs. I then remove the support stand and lower the jack. Now that the wheel's on the ground, I grab my torque wrench and do the wheel nuts up to spec, which in this case is 85 Newton meters. Of course, when I do the wheel nuts up, I tighten them up in a star pattern, or again, in this case, a cross pattern.